think it's still an open question to what extent language has access to the kind of compositional primitives that I'm arguing for here. Some of the experiments that we did, we would argue that it is, but that's debatable still.
So the one, the pink elephant example is a different category.
Well, it's a different category in a narrow sense that I'm going to be talking about learning not semantic concepts, but one-dimensional functions. So it's a different kind of function class, if you will. But I basically, I don't want to overgeneralize too much from the actual experiments that I'm going to tell you about in the modeling, right? I think that there's some deep connection between how we describe physical objects or semantic categories compositionally and how we would describe functions compositionally. But the word compositionality is thrown around a lot in a very loose way, and I'm going to try to kind of narrowly scope my talk so that I don't kind of paint myself into a corner of saying something stronger than I want to say, if that's okay. But we can come back to that at the end if you still are wondering about that. All right. So here's the Bayesian framework for function learning. In its basic form, it's super simple, right? So we get some data, D. The data that I'm going to talk about for the most part is going to be scatter plots of the sort that I just showed you, right? So XY pairs. And then we want to infer a posterior distribution over functions. The functions mapping the inputs to outputs. And the way we would do that in the Bayesian framework is that the posterior is going to be proportional to a likelihood function times a prior. So what we need to specify are those two components. I'm going to use a framework that is nice in part because it admits a particularly elegant mathematical formalization, and you can get nice analytical results. And also because there have been a number of efforts already to apply this to human function learning. So it's too bad that Tom couldn't be here today, but he was sort of the pioneer of that work. OK, so the framework is called Gaussian process regression, and here's how it works. So we can think about a Gaussian process as a kind of distribution over functions. I should say that I'm restricting the case to where we have some function that's drawn from some distribution and then corrupted by some Gaussian noise. And a function that's drawn from a Gaussian process, the reason it's called a Gaussian process is because any finite subset of points drawn from that Gaussian process are jointly Gaussian distributed. And like a Gaussian distribution, a multivariate Gaussian distribution where you have a mean vector and a covariance matrix, a Gaussian process is parameterized by a mean function and a covariance function. And we'll sort of follow standard practice and, for simplicity, take the mean function to be 0 everywhere. And so all the action is really in the covariance function, or what's sometimes called the kernel. And we can think about the kernel as parameterizing kind of expected smoothness of the function. So it's telling you how much the outputs will vary for some fixed difference in the input. And then I should say also that I'm kind of glossing over a lot of the technical details here and going to try to convey this conceptually because I think we have a diverse audience here and I don't want to get bogged down in the technical details. But basically, given a data set, you can get in closed form the posterior distribution over the functions, over the function space. And it turns out that this is actually mathematically equivalent to a particular to a weight space view where you parameterize a linear function and do posterior inference over the weight vector. So this is kind of the non-parametric view of that parametric regression problem. So let me just try to give you a sense of what it means to have different covariance functions. So I said the covariance function parameterizes the smoothness of the function. So what I'm showing you here are draws from different Gaussian processes with different covariance functions. So you can see that some of these covariance functions produce very rough functions, so they're very non-smooth, whereas others produce much smoother functions. And we can parameterize these in a whole bunch of different ways, and I'm going to talk more specifically about particular ways that we can parameterize this. So these are all draws from the prior. Right? We haven't gotten to the posterior yet. Now, once you get a draw from once you get some data, now you can compute a posterior, and the output of that posterior is essentially a bunch of mean points plus some posterior covariance over those points. So you can draw pictures like this where you have Bayesian credible intervals around a posterior mean. And depending on what covariance function you use you assume, you'll get different kinds of inferences, right? So if you have a very rough covariance function, then you're going to get results like this, where the uncertainty grows very rapidly as you move away from the training points. Oh, sure, why not? Assuming that it doesn't break everything. All right, excellent. So I mentioned that Tom Griffiths sort of started, was the one, Tom Griffiths and Chris Lucas in his lab were the ones who started taking Gaussian processes seriously as a model of human function learning. So they were particularly interested in explaining some of the biases in human function learning. In some of the classic experiments on this, for example, people are really good at learning linear functions, but if you teach them an exponential or a quadratic function, they tend to underestimate the high curvature parts of the function, and that falls naturally out of this Gaussian process framework, at least for particular choices of covariance function, because the prior is going to regularize your estimate of the function, and it's going to pull you away from high curvature regions of the function. Now, what I want to talk about today is the kind of generalization of this idea to compositional functions. To think about the motivating example that I started with. If you have some relatively complex function, how can you break it down into simpler pieces and explain the function that way? And we're going to try to formalize that in the language of covariance functions. Yeah?
So can you back up?
Yeah.
Wouldn't the same phenomenon happen if instead of using Gaussian processes, you use just standard non-parametric regression with regularization? I mean, it would also not want to do really sharp fitting.
Yes. Well.
I mean, I guess I'm getting at, like, why did you choose Gaussian processes instead of just this standard, non-parametric regularized, which will also do some smoothing for your function process?
Yeah, so all right, well, there's sort of two answers to that question. So one is that certain forms of classical non-parametric regression correspond to Gaussian process regression. So there's an interpretation. There's a particular interpretation of Gaussian processes that where you can write down them in a form of where you have a regularizer that looks just that can take the similar form to what you get in a classical non-parametric regression problem. So there's a link between the regularizer you choose for non-parametric regression and the covariance function. That a particular choice of covariance function is going to induce a particular regularizer. That's sort of the technical answer. But then there's the more theoretical answer, which is that the reason to be Bayesian, right, is that you want to be able to not just get a point estimate of a function, but also be able to represent your uncertainty. Now, these experiments aren't really getting at that at all. But some of the stuff that I'll talk about will get at this, right, where the Bayesian part is actually going to do some work for us, right? And that you're not going to get out of a frequent estimate of a non-parametric model. Okay. Okay, so here's the basic setup that I'm going to describe to you. To capture the compositionality of functions, we're going to define a kind of functional grammar that consists of two pieces. So one is a set of atoms. These are the base kernels. And the other is a set of composition operators. So these are going to take kernels and combine them into new kernels. And there's going to be I'm going to establish a connection between combinations of kernels and combinations of functions. So it's important to keep in mind that we're not specifying the functions themselves. We're only specifying the priors on the functions. OK, so here's the basic idea. And I should say that this is all coming out of this important work by James Lloyd and Dave Duveneau, where they were applying this framework to machine learning. And they defined this, a set of base kernels and composition operators from which one could construct more complex functions. And then they also created a search procedure where you could actually search over different compositions and find the best composition that would explain some particular data set. So I'm not going to go into the details of that search procedure, but implicit in whenever I talk about fitting making predictions of the theoretical framework for data, it's always going to assume that we've done some search through this space. Actually, the space is small enough that we can exhaustively enumerate all the different compositions, and then we just evaluate each of them individually. The most basic kind of kernel is the squared exponential kernel, or sometimes called the radial basis function kernel. And that's kind of the canonical kernel in machine learning that produces smooth functions, like these shown below. We can also create covariance functions that produce periodic functions. So if you have a periodic kernel, then you're going to get periodic functions. If you have a linear kernel, you'll get linear functions. A constant kernel will produce constant functions. And you can also have a white noise kernel that will produce functions that are just white noise. Okay? So these are our basic functional atoms. And then we're going to define two composition operators, multiplication and addition. So kernels are closed under multiplication and addition. If you multiply two kernels together, you will get another valid kernel. And if you sum them together, you'll also get another valid kernel. Or take any weighted combination of them, you'll get another kernel. There are other composition operators that would also yield valid kernels, but we're not going to get into those now. So just to give you a taste of how this would look, if you took, for example, two linear kernels and multiplied them together, you could get quadratic functions, or you could get, if you multiplied a squared exponential and a periodic kernel, you'd get something that looks locally periodic. Or if you added a linear and a periodic kernel, you would get something that has this periodic function plus a linear trend. Or you could get this kind of locally, you could have a periodic kernel with some smooth trend in it if you added the squared exponential and periodic kernel. So this is kind of just to give you a set of examples of the different kernel compositions that we're going to analyze. So I don't mean here to exhaust all the different ways you could combine kernels or even the set of functional atoms. But this is going to be sufficient for the experiments that we're going to study. Now, one of the really cool things that you can do with this is one of the things that these guys showed, is that you could build something like an automated statistician. And sadly, there used to be a website called the Automated Statistician where you could give it data, and it would generate this whole rather dry statistics report. And unfortunately, I think the company got acquired or something, and you can't access it anymore. But here's an example of the kind of report that it would generate. So remember, this is the airline passenger data that we were looking at before. So if you feed it those data, then it's going to generate a report that says that it has 4 additive components that have been identified. So it's saying that you're summing 4 different kernels, a linearly increasing function, an approximately periodic function with a period of 1 year, and with linearly increasing amplitude. It's smooth and has uncorrelated noise with linearly increasing standard deviation. So that's actually not that far off from the explanation that you guys gave that allowed Rachel to redraw that function. And then it will actually give you individual reports on the underlying components, right? So here's the linear component, here's the periodic component, and so on. OK, yeah, so this is just going through all those components. Now, I've been talking about a compositional framework for functions, but what are we going to actually compare this against, right? What is the alternative hypothesis here? Because the obvious sort of straw man here is that you just use one of these kernels, right? Maybe our inductive bias is that we only prefer smooth kernels, but we're not doing any kind of composition of functions. A more sophisticated alternative hypothesis derives from a very different perspective on an expressive class of functions, functional priors, that come from what's known as Bachner's theorem. So Bachner's theorem says that any stationary kernel can be represented in this spectral representation. And roughly speaking, what this means is that if you look at the spectral density is telling you the contribution of an eigenfunction with frequency s to the covariance function. And we can define flexible kernels by directly parametrizing the spectral density. So we can parameterize spectral density and then draw functions from that Gaussian process, just like any other Gaussian process. And this was the insight of Wilson and Adams. And so they showed how you can take in this case the airline passenger data, and here's the purple line here shows the empirical spectral density. And what they did is they parameterized mixtures of Gaussians in the spectral space. And so you can see that although it misses a lot of the structure here, it captures the peaks of the spectral density function. And that allows it to actually accurately extrapolate this function. So the reason we were interested in the spectral mixture kernel is because it is highly expressive, right? If you allow yourself to use an arbitrary number of mixture components, then you can capture nearly any function that you'd want to model. But at the same time, it's really not compositional in the way that I was describing before, right? You might argue that it's sort of maybe compositional in the spectral space, but it's not compositional in the kernel space in a way that I think is more intuitive for people, and I'm going to try to bolster that argument with empirical data. So I'm going to spend a lot of time comparing the predictions of the spectral mixture kernel to the predictions of the compositional kernels.
Question.
Yes?
So the mixture of Gaussian is finite or could be infinite?
They did finite, and we used finite. A mixture, right? So we're always kind of open to criticism that, all right, maybe we didn't use enough mixture components, so we try to basically choose a number of mixture components that you could generate functions of similar complexity as you would under the compositional grammar, right? There's a bunch of somewhat arbitrary choices that we had to make here, and that is potentially a weakness of the results that I'm going to show you. But we haven't seen yet a situation where, like, making somewhat different assumptions, we would get very different results. Any other questions? All right. OK, so here's the plan of the experiment. So I'm going to divide it into two parts. So the first part are basically function learning experiments. They're going to focus on function learning. And I'm going to ask this question: are human function learning judgments, particularly interpolation and extrapolation of functions, better described by compositional kernels than by a spectral mixture kernel, or even just a simple like RBF kernel? And then in the second part, I'm going to talk about kind of the bigger picture. So are compositional functions, for example, remembered better, or can you detect changes better in compositional functions? Do they affect numerosity perception? And so I'm going to argue that these compositional functions have this kind of pervasive effect on many areas of cognition. All right. Now I want to say something about stimuli here. So you might worry that if you draw functions from a Gaussian process with a compositional kernel or a spectral mixture kernel, they're going to differ in some way that we haven't really got a handle on, and that's going to explain all of our experimental results. It's really impossible to rule out all possible alternative interpretations of that sort, but what we tried to do is match the functions. So we generated a whole bunch of functions from these different priors, and then we tried to pick ones that were matched in terms of some low-level visual descriptors. So what we did is we took wavelet coefficients and tried to match them. So just to give you a sense of what these look like, so here are the compositional functions that we were looking at, and here are the spectral functions. So they don't look exactly the same, but on the other hand, at a low level of perceptual detail, it's pretty hard, I think, to tell them apart. Eric calls these our Drosophila for functions. OK, so here's the extrapolation experiment that we did, our first experiment. And the way this works is we're going to show subjects these functions. So the kind of the training part is in blue. So the blue is the same in all of these panels. And then they get to see different completions. And the way these completions are generated is that we took a Gaussian process with one of these kernels. We fit it to the blue data, and then we extrapolated it to produce the red data. And subjects are basically just asked to choose which of these completions they thought is the best. Now, in our first experiment, we drew the functions all from the compositional grammar. And perhaps not surprisingly, we found that people tended to prefer the compositional functions better. But of course, these functions were drawn from a compositional kernel, right? So maybe what we're seeing here is just that people are fitting the data that they were shown. But the second experiment, we did the same thing, but now we use functions drawn from a spectral mixture kernel. And here, we actually still find that people prefer compositional extrapolations. So even though the functions were actually not drawn from compositional functions, even though we took the function class, we offered subjects the extrapolations generated by the function class that actually generated the data, they still prefer the compositional extrapolation. So that seems like, in my view, a pretty good argument for this particular, for a compositional inductive bias. Yeah, Dan. Yeah.
Did you train participants beforehand on each of these priors?
No. No, they didn't get any training at all. Yeah.
Do you think that would, I would suspect that might.
Yes, I mean, yeah, I imagine that if you train people on a particular class of functions, then they're going to adapt to that. I guess it depends a little bit on what you tell them about the testing phase, whether they think they're going to get something from the same class. Yeah.
Sorry, could you explain that figure? What was presented and what was chosen?
So the experiment looks like this, right? Just like I showed you before. The only difference between the first experiment and the second experiment is that these blue functions here were drawn in the first experiment from a compositional kernel. And in the second experiment, they were drawn from a spectral mixture kernel. And in both cases, people preferred, so people chose the extrapolation more often from the compositional kernel rather than from the spectral mixture kernel. Yeah?
Did they get feedback on how they did on the first experiment?
No. Yeah, there's no feedback here. Yeah. OK. Now we're going to try to get a kind of more nuanced view of what people's inductive biases are. So this is consistent with inductive bias, but we haven't really tried to measure the inductive bias over functions directly. So what we've done in the next experiment is adapt a technique that was developed by Tom Griffiths called Markov chain Monte Carlo. And I'm not going to go into all the details here, but basically the idea is that you're going to set things up so that people implement or simulate a Markov chain whose stationary distribution is their prior. And that involves them asking them to accept or reject particular extrapolations. And then, in effect, you're implementing something like a Metropolis-Hastings algorithm, but with a person. Right? That's why it's called Markov chain Monte Carlo with people. And then you're going to look at the asymptotic behavior of their accept-reject behavior. And what you get out of this are these histograms where it might be hard to see from far away, but each of these bars corresponds to a particular composition, and then the height of the bars tells you the frequency of that composition in the population. And then each of these panels is showing you one particular true generating compositional function. So in this case, for example, this was a linear plus periodic function. It was generated. These are functions generated from a linear plus periodic kernel, and then we're looking at which functions people tended to converge on. And the red bars here, which might be hard to see in the back, tell you the preferred, the actual true generating function in this histogram. And so what you can see here is that in every case, the true generating function is also the most preferred function. But you can also see that there are a bunch of other functions that had a fair amount of probability mass in addition to the true generating function. So it's not like everyone's just delta functions on the true generating function. Now, we kind of stopped there and didn't try to characterize this further, but I think it's an interesting question for future work to try to understand better, why is it that these histograms look the way they do? What does that tell us about human inductive biases? The next experiment we did was essentially the same thing that we did before, but on real-world functions. And I'll just summarize it by saying that these real-world functions tell the same story, which is that people preferred the compositional completions of real-world functions over the spectral mixture completions of those functions.
Question?
Yes?
When they're presented that, they're not told it's gym membership.
No, that's right. The presentation is the same as before, but what we're trying to do here is to rule out that there's some weird idiosyncrasy in the kinds of functions that we were showing before, which were drawn from artificial processes. Yeah. Oh, I always forget. These are Google searches for, I think it's a band or something. I forget now. I always try to remind myself to look up Wham before I give this talk, and I always forget.
People of a certain age remember.
OK, well, can you tell us?
It was a band.
Yeah, OK, I was right. All right. Yeah.
George Michael.
Oh, George Michael. OK, right. All right. No one wants to betray their age here. All right. So the next experiment we did is instead of having people do forced choices between functions, we had people actually draw the functions, draw the completions rather. And then we looked at now we're looking at instead of looking at proportion correct, we're looking at the root mean squared error from each kernel's predictions as an index of that kernel's fit. And what we find for interpolation, actually, interestingly, the compositional function doesn't do better than the radial basis function. Oh, and by the way, lower here is now better. So lower here means that a particular kernel matches people's drawing behavior better. So although for interpolation, for some reason, compositional didn't really do better than RBF, you do see this advantage for the extrapolation judgments. And in both cases, the compositional kernel does better than the spectral mixture kernel. Another thing that we were interested in was predictability. So if I show you some data, now I ask you to make a metacognitive judgment about, or sorry, not a metacognitive, a judgment about how well you think you would be able to do on if I showed you new inputs from that function. We ask the question, do people find compositional functions more predictable? And the answer is yes. So here I'm showing you the results as a function of sample size, but basically over every possible sample size that we measured, people show a preference for the compositional function over the spectral mixture function. So people find compositional functions more predictable. Now, one criticism of what I've shown you so far is that it is essentially a kind of visual pattern analysis. Whereas in the traditional function learning literature, what people usually have done in the past is give people input-output pairs one at a time. So they give you the input, you make a prediction, and then you get feedback. And so we wanted to ask whether our results extend to that kind of setting. So we did a traditional function learning paradigm that looks like this. So it's very simple. They enter their prediction, and then they get some feedback. But essentially, the results are the same. This is kind of hard to see because all of this space. But even in this traditional function learning paradigm, you see an advantage of compositional over spectral kernels. So this is what I'm showing you here is the difference in prediction minus true function. So people are better at learning that function if it's compositional. And we can also fit each of these models to the behavior and show that the compositional model has a much better fit to the data from this paradigm than from the trial to the trial by trial data in this paradigm compared to the spectral mixture function. Okay, so that's the end of this kind of barrage of function learning experiments. And I can take questions on this part, or I can keep going to the kind of the broader implications. Yeah, Dan.
So one question I have is about whether something's being conflated here, right? Because under the compositional, it's likely to get something linear, right? And like linear with a periodic pattern, where that's like very unlikely under the other pattern, right? And so
yeah.
It's not so clear to me that this is like about composition in some ways. Like
but you wouldn't be able to learn these if you just let's say you just had the linear kernel, right? You wouldn't be able to learn these functions. I mean, the extrapolations would look totally different, right? So I agree with you that there's going to be a preference for linearity. In fact, that is kind of the oldest kind of cornerstone result in the function learning literature is that people have a preference for positively increased, at positive slope linear functions. So we would want to reproduce that property in whatever prior we postulated.
Am I right that the mixture of like density, that's Fourier line, it's quite unlikely to get a linear function out of that?
Yeah, what would you need to do to get a linear? That's right. Yeah, at least if you have a mixture of Gaussians in there. Yeah. So that's actually that's really our point, right? Is that you can it's pretty expressive. You can get a lot of different kinds of functions out of that. But the probability that you get linear functions or functions of this particular form is pretty low. So I'm not sure if it's conflating. I mean, maybe what you're saying is that we haven't really dissected all the different parts. Like we haven't said what happens if you had a compositional kernel but you didn't have linear, or you only had linear plus periodic. So we haven't done all of those different combinations to really zero in on the right sort of compositional kernel. Yeah.
On a similar note, I mean, is there a notion of measure of complexity or complicatedness
Um,
for this? Because it feels like compositional, you have a small vocabulary, is sort of simpler than.
right.
I don't know how many mixtures do you have.
That's a good question. I don't remember off the top of my head. I think that we optimized that, but I can't remember off the top of my head how many mixture components.
Is that apples and oranges there?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. So I think, I mean, once you pick a prior, right? Then so I think that there's a way to, in the kind of the standard way, we can talk about description length of probability distributions. So we haven't tried to directly compare the description length of these different Gaussian processes. Our argument is that psychologically speaking, the compositional representation has a shorter description length. It's more natural for people, and that's going to come up again in these later experiments I told you about. But we haven't really developed a way to directly measure that, right? So it might be possible to measure the description length of the two priors, and maybe that's something that we should do.
Because if the other class is just more complicated, period, then I don't know how to make that precise.
Yeah.
It's not surprising that it's hard to predict.
Right. Well, I get. It depends what you mean by more complicated, right? Because you could have a given data set might be more complicated or less complicated depending on what your description language is, right? So it's hard. The thing that we're trying to do here is ask what is the description language that people have.
It's generated from a model, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so if it's generated from a more complicated model, it's somehow more complicated and just harder to predict. The prediction model is still a human being, same model.
Yeah.
If the data is from a harder model.
Yeah. Well, that.
Exactly how to make that.
Yeah, I know that's a difficulty here, and that's partly why we try to match them in terms of their low level features. But that doesn't necessarily rule out the possibility that one function class is more complicated than the other. But I think from a learning perspective, right, the sample complexity of a function class is going to depend not just on the complexity of the data, but also the complexity, but also your inductive bias. So that's part of the reason why I'm kind of dancing around this issue, because I don't think it's even if it's the case that spectral mixture functions are going to be more complicated in some way than compositional functions. Whether or not they're more or less learnable depends on what people's priors are.
But one should equalize for description. Then.
Yes, if you can, that's right. All right, so I'm going to keep going. So Jiaying Zhao, who some of you might remember, who was a student at Princeton, did a very interesting experiment with her student where they were looking at numerosity perception. So what they would do is they would show these displays where you had these colored circles, and people's job was just to count the number of circles. They could completely ignore color if they wanted to. But one of the things that they did here is that they would show people a sequence of these displays, and in one condition, in the structured condition, there would be correlations between particular colors. So certain colors would tend to co-occur more often than others. Whereas in the random displays, the pattern of co-occurrence was completely random. No colors co-occurred more with each other than any others. And one thing that they found was that when the structured displays, so overall, people tended to underestimate numerosity, but the underestimation was greater for the structured displays. In other words, if there's some underlying statistical structure in the display, people seem to be more inclined to underestimate the true numerosity. And so we were interested in this phenomenon and asked whether this would hold true for draws from functions. So if the structure there was from a functional structure rather than from co-occurrence of colors. So what we did is we created these displays of dots that sat on a particular function. And then what we did is we colored some number of these dots red, and people's job was to count the number of red dots here. And what we did then is we compared people's numerosity estimates for different kinds of function classes. And what we found is that people tended to underestimate more for compositional functions than for spectral mixture functions. So this dovetails with this claim from Zhao and Yu that when there's structure, underestimation tends to be greater. And if compositional structure is kind of like the native description language for functions, then that structure might play a larger role in this underestimation bias than the structure induced by a spectral mixture kernel. The next thing that we looked at was change detection. So there are these experiments by Brady and Tenenbaum where they showed these displays of dots where the task of the subject was they would see one of these displays, then it would disappear, and a new display would come on, and they'd have to detect whether there was a change in the dot configuration from one display to the next. And what they showed was that the ability to discriminate between to detect changes, here measured by D prime, increases with the amount of regularity in the displays. So if, for example, the displays consist of these lines of colored dots, then it's very easy to detect changes. But if the dots are just randomly arranged, then it's very hard to detect changes. So we looked at this, again, with functions where we had these dotted functions, and then we changed one of the dots, and people had to detect that, and we manipulated whether the functions were drawn from a compositional or a spectral mixture kernel. And overall, we found that it was easier to detect changes in compositional functions than in non-compositional functions. And I've broken it down here by how much change there was. But in general, that was the finding. And we also fit an ideal observer model to this task where we can calculate in closed form the probability that two displays were generated by different functions, that the posterior probability conditional on the data. And we can show that the model fit for the compositional function was better than the spectral mixture function for the spectral mixture kernel. So, by the way, I should say that maybe this goes some way towards addressing this concern about what if the compositional functions were just more complicated than the compositional functions. So, whenever I show you model fit, what I'm doing is asking for all the functions, both compositional and spectral mixture functions. If I assume a particular prior, compositional or spectral, which of those priors will better explain people's behavioral data, right? And so that, I think, is to some extent immune from this question, right? Because it's asking about priors rather than the human priors rather than the biases induced by function class, because we're actually averaging over different function classes here. Okay. So we've also looked at this in short-term memory. So there's another interesting study by Tim Brady where they looked at these displays of colored circles, and after some delay, one of those items would be selected, and subjects had to make a continuous report of the color using a color wheel. What they found was that when there is co-occurrent structure in the colors, so when certain colors tend to co-occur more often than others, then people were better at reproducing the color than if the colors were all randomly co-occurring with each other. So it brings us back to this question: if there's structure, then the people can exploit that statistical structure to compress information in memory and remember more, and that's what's shown by this study. And we looked at this in short-term memory using a version of the Sternberg paradigm, where we would show a rapid sequence of these functions, and then we'd show a probe where it could either have been, the probe function could either have been in the study set or not in the study set, and subjects had to make a judgment about whether it was old or new. And we found that people overall were more correct for compositional functions than for spectral mixture functions, again suggesting that compositional functions are somehow more memorable or compressible. And we did some computational modeling with an ideal observer analysis where we can compute the probability that the probe item was in the study set. And we again see that the compositional model provides a better fit to the human data than the spectral mixture function. So how am I doing on time? When is this supposed to end?
We have the room until 1:30. But
Okay.
you don't have to go until 1:30.
Yeah, okay. So I wanted to come back to what I started with, the demo that I started with, where we showed a function and then had someone redraw it from a verbal description. So we actually did experiments like this. And I'm going to just show you one piece of that project. So we'd show people functions like this. We'd have them describe it, and then we'd give that description to another person and have them draw that function. And then we compared how well their reconstructed function matched the original function. And it turns out that people can actually do this pretty well, and that, importantly, the reconstruction ability was higher for compositional than for non-compositional functions. So we measured this in a few different ways. So this is just the absolute error between the two lines. We also looked at wavelet distance, and we also looked at subjective ratings. So we had a separate group of people rate how good these reconstructions were. And they all basically tell the same story, that compositional functions are easier to reconstruct from natural language descriptions than non-compositional spectral mixture functions. So maybe coming back to Uri's point, we can debate whether this is really, what is this really telling us about language? We'd like to think that the compositional language of thought that we use to describe functions mentally interfaces with the compositional language that we use to describe functions verbally. Now, it's a little bit hard to make that claim airtight because we don't know enough yet about the compositional language of verbal functional descriptions, right? But this is one piece of suggestive evidence that might be true. So let me summarize. I've presented a whole range of data to suggest that compositional functions are better accounts of interpolation and extrapolation. They're perceived as more predictable or regular. They're easier to detect changes in. They're more memorable. And they're easier to reconstruct from natural language descriptions. And so taken together, I'd like to make the argument that compositional functions represent something important, capture an important insight into human inductive biases that are used for function learning. And we don't know whether this particular instantiation of a compositional prior is the right one, right? There's a lot more to explore there, but at least this is the first step towards providing some experimental evidence that people do represent functions in this compositional way. Now, some of the same machinery that I've talked about today, I've applied to other domains. One of the things that we've been focusing on in particular lately has been hierarchical motion perception. There's a lot of interesting phenomena in that area, but I wonder if maybe I should skip that part in the interests of time, unless I don't want to keep you guys here too long. Maybe I'll just show you just a little bit about this. So if you look at a complex scene like Spider-Man and Dr. Octopus fighting on the top of this train, it's easy for us to parse this into a bunch of hierarchically nested motions. So we can see the two characters' motion relative to the train's motion, also the motion relative to each other, and then the body parts relative to the body. And there's an important question here: how do we extract this information from a visual scene? And there seminal work by Gunnar Johansson in the 1940s and 50s both gave sort of the initial experimental data that speaks to this question, and also the initial theoretical idea to possibly answer it. So he would do these displays. Hopefully this works. So if you oh no, cannot play media. Let's see, does this one work? Okay. So he would make displays like the following, where people would perceive vertical motion that's nested in a horizontally translating reference frame. But if you took the bottom and top flanker dots away, then people would perceive diagonally oscillating motion. So it shows how, depending on the structure of the context, people can interpret the same motion in very different, qualitatively different fashions. Oh yeah, and there was another example of this was the Duncker wheel that some of you might be familiar with. So if you put a light, the original experiments were done with putting a light on the rim of a bike wheel in a dark room and rolling the wheel. And if you just have a light on the rim, what you see is this weird-looking cycloidal motion that I just showed you. But if you put a light on the hub, now you see this rotational motion. So now this thing that previously looked like it was bouncing cycloidally now looks like it's rotating around a horizontally translating reference frame. And Johansen had this idea that this could be answered by what he called vector analysis, where you take the dot motions and you decompose them into the sum of a bunch of vectors. That's what he thought the visual system was doing. So it would look something like this. So this is the observed motion, and you decompose it into this horizontal component and this vertical component. But the problem is that many different vector interpretations are plausible for a given pattern of motion. So how does our visual system choose one? And various psychologists tried to answer this question, appealing to different kinds of principles, but there was not really a unifying computational theory of this. So what we tried to do was build upon important work in Bayesian models of motion perception, in particular this work by Yair Weiss and Ted Adelson on what they call the slow and smooth model. So this is the essential idea is very simple. The idea is that you have some prior over motions that is slow and smooth, that motions are slow and they're also spatially smooth. And then you combine that with the measured motion energy in a particular location in an image, and then by Bayesian you get a posterior. Bayesian vector analysis is essentially a generalization of that to hierarchical motion. So the basic primitive of this theory is the motion tree. So each node in this motion tree corresponds to some relative motion component. So like, and more precisely to a vector field of motion. So this node would correspond to the Spider-Man's motion relative to the train. And this is Spider-Man's arm relative to Spider-Man. So if you want to get the observed motion of Spider-Man's hand, the actual measured motion energy, then you'd sum up all the motion components along the path to its hand. Now, if we model each of these vector fields as drawn from a Gaussian process, then because of the properties of the Gaussian process, we can get the marginal likelihood of any particular motion tree in closed form, which is a very convenient mathematical property. So essentially, we can do a search over the different motion trees to ask which one has the highest posterior probability. Right, and that's how we would do it. And so I've applied this to a number of the classic phenomena that Johansen did, for example, the one that I was showing you before. So the motion tree in this case is super simple, right? It's just a horizontal component and then a vertical component nested within it. You can get also the Duncker wheel, and as well as a bunch of other phenomena, like you can apply this to biological motion, like moving skeletons, and you can get a hierarchical decomposition of the body. You can also explain various kinds of motion contrast and transparent motion phenomena, which I won't go into. And we've done a whole bunch of experiments where we constructed these motion quintets, so you'd have 5 different dots moving, and the motions would be composed of the same underlying 3 components, but arranged into different structures. And we can show that, I'm going a little bit fast here because I don't want to take up too much time, but what we can show here is that actually the predictions of this hierarchical motion model match quantitatively extremely well with the experimental data. So what we ask people to do is we'd show them the moving display, and then we'd highlight 2 dots and we'd ask, is this particular dot motion nested in the motion of this other dot? So this is sort of a non-standard psychophysical task. We've recently started doing a bunch of other things with multiple object tracking and motion prediction. But here we just asked about nesting judgments, and we can get a very strong quantitative prediction about people's judgments of a hierarchical structure from this model. All right, so to finish up, compositionality, the claim here is that compositionality helps us tame the complexity of real-world functions. And I've shown you a bunch of experimental evidence that suggests that we have these strong inductive biases for compositional functions. And we can formalize those inductive biases using a Bayesian framework that's based on Gaussian process regression. So I'd like to thank you guys for listening, and I'm happy to take questions.